So hello my friends, Devaun Lennox here, PhotographyPX.com. In today's video, we'll cover the full frame versus crop sensor debate. Note you can find timestamps in the description down below. You can also scrub through the video to skip to a more relevant section of the video if you'd like. But with that said, let's get started. In digital photography, there are two main categories of cameras determined based on sensor size, that is full frame and crop sensors. And if you ever picked up a camera, you've likely heard these terms thrown around before at some point. Of course, many professionals rave about the superiority of full frame sensors, but the reality is that both of these formats has its pros and cons, and there's actually more of a compelling argument to be made on both sides than you would think. That said, what's the difference between a full frame and a crop sensor? Ultimately, the difference between a full frame camera and a crop censored one is purely the physical size of their sensors. And the differences we see in image quality characteristics like angle of view, image magnification, and depth of field are all ultimately the result of the sensor's dimensions and its subsequent effects on capturing images. So when you hear photographers throw around the term full frame or crop sensor, what we're really describing here is the physical sensor size of the camera that we're talking about. That said, a full frame sensor has dimensions of 36 by 24 millimeters, or a close approximation. And these dimensions replicate the 35 millimeter film format. It also yields the 3:2 aspect ratio. Now, any camera with a sensor size that's smaller than 35 millimeters or 36 by 24 millimeters specifically is considered a cropped sensor. The most common crop sensor formats include APS-C and micro four thirds. The APS-C format measures around 22.5 by 15 millimeters, while micro four thirds measures 18 by 13.5 millimeters, creating a 4:3 aspect ratio, hence the name micro four thirds. But now, if the main difference between a full frame and a crop sensor is physical size, what exactly is the crop factor? Well, since full frame cameras eventually became the basis of the focal length measurements we use today, it was important manufacturers reference any smaller sensor in full frame equivalent terms. And this practice is what we now refer to as the crop factor. But quick commercial break. Did you know PhotographyPX launched a sister company called PXPresets.com? Well, if you didn't, PXPresets.com is going to be your next one-stop shop for Adobe Lightroom desktop and mobile presets. On PX Presets, you can find a large selection of presets to shortcut the process of getting high quality images and consistent branding across your imagery. We have a large selection of styles that are well suited for food, products, portraiture, fashion, beauty, and much more. We're also running a special right now for our mega collection. So if you want to upgrade your entire workflow in one fell swoop, now's a great opportunity. So if you're in the market for some high quality Lightroom presets to shortcut your workflow, feel free to check out pxpresets.com. With that said, back to the video. The crop factor or multiplier is the effective focal length magnification caused by using a 35 millimeter full frame lens on a smaller sensor. Or put another way, it's the measured difference or crop in the angle of view that occurs. And without adjusting for this difference, a crop sensor camera with a 35 millimeter full frame lens crops the edges of the photo, resulting in a tighter angle of view and an entirely new focal length altogether. So to combat this effect, manufacturers have made dedicated lenses for each cropped system camera. But how does this work in the real world? Well, say a camera has a 1.5 times multiplier. Attaching a 35 millimeter f1.8 full frame lens causes it to act like a 52.5 millimeter lens instead. It also changes its effective depth of field. And now taking a photo at the same distance with the same point of view produces images with a tighter angle of view than on a matching full frame camera. And it also produces a different depth of field in bokeh rendering. But now that we've covered the main differences, what are the advantages of full frame sensors? First is angle of view. Since full frame sensors have a focal magnification ratio of 1.0 times, they don't have a crop. And this in turn makes the attached lens behave true to its actual focal length. So a 50 millimeter lens provides a genuine 50 millimeter equivalent angle of view. And this fact is essential for shooting wide angle mediums like landscapes, architecture, and real estate photography, where you'll frequently use a 16 to 35 millimeter zoom lens. And if you use a crop sensor camera here, it'll effectively convert that same 16 to 35 millimeter lens into a 24 to 52 millimeter one, which won't be wide enough for most of your scenes, and that will become a deal breaker. Next is dynamic range. Full-frame cameras having a larger sensor with bigger pixels can produce a higher effective dynamic range. Generally, most offer an effective dynamic range of 10 to 12 stops, while crop sensors provide less. And this in turn lets them capture images with better detail in high contrast scenes. Next, signal to noise, high ISO, and low light performance. Being larger in physical size, full-frame sensors collect more light than a smaller sensor because it has larger individual pixels or a smaller pixel density. And this particular factor effectively increases the camera's signal to noise ratio compared to a crop sensor with matching resolution. Thus, you don't have to increase your ISO as far, and you also get less noise at higher ISOs at equivalent settings. Next, depth of field. A full-frame sensor will indeed create a more shallow depth of field when compared to a crop sensor at an identical effective focal length. This occurs because a full-frame camera still has the longer focal length attached, altering its angle of view and lens compression. And the longer the focal length, the more shallow the resulting depth of field technically. And that in turn yields a more pleasing blurred background and a strong artistic effect focused on your subject. But with that covered, what are the two main downsides to full-frame cameras? Firstly, their price and their bulkiness. Full-frame is designed to meet the needs of professionals, but unfortunately, many of the camera bodies and lenses reflect that intention and are substantially more expensive to suit. And this cost of entry becomes an enormous barrier for many photographers. Secondly, even with the advent of small full-frame mirrorless cameras like the Sony A7 series, there's no debating the fact that full-frame cameras are heavy and bulky. And coupled with the added heft of most full-frame prime lenses, you can easily lug around a 5-pound camera setup. Not ideal. This amount of weight will definitely cause strain on your wrists, neck, shoulders, and hips, and it could become a deal breaker for longer outings. Thankfully, in comes crop sensor cameras, and they bring several notable advantages to the table. Most notably, since this format has a smaller sensor and usually lacks internal weather sealing, these cameras are almost always smaller, lighter, and more compact than their counterparts. And this difference is especially apparent if you compare mirrorless options. Next, while you sometimes will want a shallow depth of field, it's not always a must, and rather it's the exact opposite for mediums like products, macro photography, architectural photography, and landscape photography, where you often want as much in focus as possible. Thankfully, with a crop sensor camera, you'll get as much as 2 stops more effective depth of field, and this advantage alone could be a deciding factor if you frequently shoot mediums that demand high aperture settings. But in conclusion, which sensor format is best for you specifically? Truthfully, this particular debate doesn't have a clear winner. Both of these formats have their advantages, and it's important to highlight that most crop sensors offer largely matching image quality these days, especially in well-lit scenes. So a bump in image quality alone isn't necessarily enough to make this particular choice. Instead, it comes down to which pros and cons are most acceptable in your eyes, and that will depend on which medium of photography you're actually shooting. For sports, wildlife, and photojournalism, crop sensor cameras reign supreme, while for portraits, wide-angle landscapes, and low-light scenes, full-frame cameras still remain king. That said though, I hope this video shed some light on the debate. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you found the content of it valuable, insightful, and you learned something meaningful here. If you're new to our channel, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. If you have any comments, questions, or feel like I've overlooked something in the course of the video, please let me know down below. I've been your host, Devaun Lennox, Photography P. .com.